My name is Deborah Wallendahl, and as a Diversity Equal Opportunity Coordinator, I spend a lot of my time working with people about talking about the value of diversity and also helping organizations focus on becoming culturally competent systems. This session today is designed to focus on your role as a caregiver and the importance of developing cultural competence skills. First of all, I'd like to explain the meaning of cultural competence, but before I do that, let's talk a little bit about why this is so important for us to discuss, especially in healthcare. First of all, changing demographics. We know that the world around us is going to be very different. In fact, they say by the year 2020, almost 35% of our total population will be comprised of people of different racial and cultural and ethnic groups. We also know that our senior population is going to be increasing by leaps and bounds. Your clients and patients, as well as the people you work with on a daily basis, will come from diverse backgrounds and experiences. The second reason we talk about this today is the quality of care. In order to provide the optimum or best care for your patients or clients, you will need to practice cultural competency. And again, we'll explain that a little bit in the future. Third, sensitivity. In the simplest form, being culturally competent and valuing diversity will help you be more sensitive to the needs of those you are caring for. So what do we mean by cultural competency? Cultural competency is the knowledge, the attitudes, behaviors, skills, policies, and protocols, which means the way we do things, that allow an individual or system to work effectively across cultures in the best possible manner. It allows a caregiver to respond with respect and empathy in a way that values the individual in their care. It means that one has the knowledge and skills to work effectively across cultures. What are some of the key characteristics of someone who is culturally competent? A culturally competent person is someone who is aware of his or her own culture and values and respects differences. So you have a pretty clear understanding of who you are, where you come from, what things are important to you, and your own values. Secondly, this culturally competent person is aware of their own biases and prejudices and understands how they affect their interactions with others. It will be important to understand, as we'll discuss later, that we all have biases and prejudices. Third, a culturally competent individual has culture-specific knowledge. In other words, terms that are specific to a culture. So if we're dealing with the Hispanic culture, we might understand the difference between using the term Chicano or Latina or Hispanic and what that exactly means. Fourth, and I think one of the most important, a culturally competent individual can communicate effectively. That might not only be listening, but understanding and being able to effectively speak with people of different cultures. Fifth, the culturally competent individual is able to build strong cross-cultural relationships. That's going to be important as you're dealing with specific individuals because you're going to need to establish trust and rapport with those individuals. And sometimes that will create some challenges for you, but again, the culturally competent individual has a lot of tools and skills to help them adjust to those things. Sixth, the culturally competent individual is flexible and can adapt to diversity. You have to be, in a sense, willing to go with the flow. And while in your field it will be critical to do things a certain way, there will be important ways to deal with health care and the delivery of care to your patient or your client, at the same time you need to be able to adapt and be flexible to where that person is at that point in time based on their culture. And finally, the culturally competent individual is able and willing to be an ally to those who are different from them. And sometimes that's extremely difficult for us. We may need to come up and be an advocate for an individual who cannot speak for themselves. We may need to be there to be supportive and to help that person try to communicate to others around them. So I think it's also important in this next phase that we start talking about some of the barriers to becoming culturally competent or to valuing diversity. First of all, realize that all of us have biases, prejudices, and stereotypes about other groups. We'd like to think we're not, but we need to realize that we are. We're not born with them, we develop them over a period of time. So what do we mean by those three terms? Number one, a bias is what we call a mental determination of someone. It's a preference. It's saying, I'm biased towards African American people. I have certain beliefs about them, those kinds of things. That would be a bias. When someone has a prejudice against an individual, a group, or a race, it means they have formed an opinion about them before they even have the facts. We've made a judgment. It is a dislike or even a hostile attitude towards a specific culture or a group. Stereotypes, then, are the standardized or often rigid mental pictures we have in our minds about members of a group. When we act on our stereotypes, we ignore the individuality of the person who is in our care. It is really hard because sometimes we'll assume and make generalizations, and that's what happens with stereotypes. We assume that all Hispanics think alike, or we assume that all elderly people want to be treated in a certain way. And sometimes those stereotypes can get in the way, again, of treating the individual as a unique person. We all need to realize, as I said, that we have some level of biases and prejudices and stereotypes. It's how we act on them that is most important. Now, let's look at a few of the other barriers beyond those biases and prejudices and stereotypes. One of the other barriers that sometimes gets in the way of being culturally competent is a lack of real experiences. I can remember once going through a training and a young woman said to me, you know, I'm 41 years old and I've never had a conversation with anyone who is black or African American. She said, I've realized that I have a lot of beliefs about people who are African American. I've never even had a conversation with that individual. That's why it's really important to realize what lack of real experiences we have and how we can create real experiences for ourselves to reduce that barrier. Another thing that gets in the way is simply fear. Fear of differences, fear of the unknown, fear of people who are different from us, or fear of what we've heard about these people based on what others have told us. Again, we reduce the fear by increasing our real life experiences. And finally, another barrier to think about, and we'll talk about this a lot more later on in this session, is the fact that sometimes we have communication conflicts. Sometimes we are now not able to effectively communicate across different cultures. Our own way of dealing with things non-verbally or verbally sometimes gets in the way of delivering a message. So we'll talk about those barriers a little bit more. At this point, I think it also would be helpful to define two other terms as we continue to talk about cultural competency. What do we mean by the term diversity? Diversity in its simplest term means differences. We'll go through some more specific examples of diversity in a moment. Culture, on the other hand, is made up of the values, the beliefs, and traditions learned and handed down from generation to generation. We can talk about the richness, for example, of the Hispanic culture again, or we can even understand that an occupation such as healthcare or law enforcement or education can have its own culture as well. When you think of diversity, I want you to think about and have an awareness of the bigger picture. As I go through some of these different categories, think about how they might impact your work as a caregiver. For example, there is diversity of race. We know of African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and sometimes our understanding of the cultural beliefs of those races or certain things that are typical of those races might impact our ability to give care to them. There might be certain taboos for them, things that are not familiar to them, that they're not comfortable with. You need to be aware of that. Or if you have, again, some negative bias or prejudice or stereotype about one of these specific races, you have to make sure it doesn't impact the delivery of care to that individual when you're working with them. Next, ethnicity, and this follows pretty close with race. Ethnicity would be your ethnic heritage, your ancestry. We know that we're seeing an increasing number of immigrants coming into our communities. And again, don't let things like accents get in the way of you thinking that maybe someone who has an accent that maybe you can't understand, you don't want to spend as much time with. Or sometimes people think if a person speaks with an accent, they are less intelligent than me. So again, and sometimes even people see someone or hear someone speak with a British accent, they may think that person is more cultural, more advanced, more educated. So be cautious of generalizing too much, again, based on ethnicity. The next category we'd like to look at is disability. It's very important to remember when you're talking about an individual who has a disability that you identify them as such. This is an individual or a person who has a disability as opposed to a disabled person. We need to focus again on the individual. Oftentimes we find ourselves looking at a person with a disability and we decide what they can't do, as opposed to realizing how much skills and talents and potential this person has. Again, a person with a disability will identify for you exactly what their limitations might be. And you need to be conscious that you may need to work with hearing impaired interpreters, you may need to work with people who have physical limitations, and all of those kinds of things will help you develop a better awareness of how to treat that person with dignity and respect. The next area that we'll talk about regarding diversity is sexual orientation. And this category especially sometimes has some very strong moral value or religious concerns regarding it. The most important thing regarding sexual orientation is to realize you may be dealing with a patient or a client who identifies himself as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and what you need to do is, again, treat this person with dignity and respect and provide the best care possible to them. And forget any of the biases or stereotypes or prejudices you might have. Again, it's the quality of care and the sensitivity for the patient. Next, age. As I mentioned before, we have an increasing senior population. Those numbers because, again, the quality of health care, people are living longer, and again, we need to be conscious of a generational issue. People who are older and who have had different experiences than us sometimes have different needs. They have different expectations of how they should be treated. And I think especially with our senior population, the most important thing is to remember patience. The next category is gender. Now, this will be critical especially if you, for example, are a male caregiver providing care to a female or vice versa. Sometimes there might be concerns about privacy, the person feeling somewhat self-conscious about you, a person of the other gender, taking care of them. Again, be conscious and respectful of any nonverbal cues that you might identify that would be a concern. And that should help you deliver care, again, in the best possible way. The next category we'll talk about as well is socioeconomic background. And that means you might be dealing with an individual who's from a different income level than you. They might be someone who is from a very poor background or might be on welfare. Again, remember to treat them with dignity and respect. The other categories that we might sometimes look at when we talk about diversity would be religion. And in these days we have an increasing variety of religious affiliations that we need to be conscious of, especially regarding traditions and certain ways of doing things and their impression of healthcare. And then also another area is geographic. So it might be urban versus rural as far as the geographic location of where that person was raised or where they currently are from. Remember that the goal is to help you provide culturally responsive services. This can be done in 3 ways. First, develop cultural awareness. You must again examine your own biases and prejudices and understand how these impact on your interaction with culturally diverse clients or patients. 2, have cultural knowledge. What do you know about the culture of another person? Oftentimes, this can be obtained through reading or even conversations with that individual. It's okay to ask questions about a person's cultural background, maybe their religious beliefs, even other things about disabilities and any other thing that you might have a concern about. That's the best way to gain your cultural knowledge. And finally, practice cultural skills. It's important to integrate your cultural awareness and your cultural knowledge into your work. It becomes a natural process over time, and again, this really, bottom line, helps you develop culturally responsive service. Finally, I would like to talk about a very important part of developing cultural competence, communication. You must be able to effectively communicate across cultural lines, as I mentioned before. So first, let's talk about some of the barriers to effective cross-cultural communication. First, assumed similarity. Too often we believe that everybody thinks the same, is the same, because a certain person is from a specific group, that they're all going to think alike. And we also think often, and we assume, that the same gesture means the same in the English language in the United States as it would in a European country or an Asian country. Be careful. Oftentimes, Gestures and certain phrases have different meanings in different countries. Next, nonverbal communication. They tell us 70% or more of our style of communication is done nonverbally. You need to be conscious of what you look like when you're talking. Are your words matching the way your body language and your gestures, your facial expressions, and your eye contact are making? And oftentimes you need to realize not all cultures are comfortable with eye contact. So you need to be able to effectively communicate again. Next, verbal language. Is your message being understood? Is the person you're caring for clearly understanding what you're saying? Next, don't have the tendency to evaluate. That can be a true barrier. You need to not jump to conclusions or judgments about specific people. You should not dismiss or minimize where a person is at based on the evaluation you have made with them. Again, first impressions do mean a lot, but don't jump to conclusions based on those first impressions. And finally, again, as I've said many times throughout this training, preconceptions about individuals and stereotypes can be a barrier to effectively communicating across cultural lines. Now I think the most important part. Let's talk about some of those strategies to bridging those cross-cultural communication barriers. Self-awareness and consciousness of actions. Be aware of what you're doing. Know your assumptions, know your stereotypes, and I think real important, understand your own comfort level. How comfortable are you talking with someone from a different country? How comfortable are you working with a patient who has HIV/AIDS? How comfortable are you working with a person who maybe has a mental illness, is not even aware of what they're doing? You have to determine your own comfort levels. Secondly, listen with respect. Remember to give the person your full attention. I can remember in my previous life as a social worker oftentimes spending half hour to an hour with an elderly person who just wanted to talk about their family experience, everything about telling you about their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and every ache and pain they had. And sometimes it's really hard to listen with respect when you're worried about what you need to do in the next 5 minutes. So again, be respectful to that individual, be courteous, and try to have patience. The third thing is to develop cultural specific awareness. You need to be, as I had said to you before, have some knowledge of cultures, understand that certain taboos or values, beliefs, or mores are important to a culture. That helps if you can educate yourself. That will, again, help you create an awareness. And it's important as well to develop your own cultural awareness. And the fourth one is to treat people uniquely. Don't assume anything about anyone. Treat the person as an individual, take them where they're at, and focus on what their needs are at the time. Next, seek out information. As I mentioned before, it's okay to ask questions. Sometimes you may have to go through a series of routine questions that you need to ask, and sometimes you may need to explain to the individual that this is part of what you need to do in order to give them the best care possible. That's okay to seek out that information. Next, tolerate ambiguity, or what I'll call uncertainty. Things may not be as clear-cut as you'd like them. You just need, again, to be patient and flexible. Next, establish trust and show concern and empathy. And I've kind of highlighted this before, but again, establish a rapport, establish trust with your patients or those clients you're working with. Over a period of time, that will especially help you to develop the best care. They will feel more comfortable with you. They will share more of their experiences. And again, bottom line, help you deliver the best care possible to them. Show sensitivity to privacy and embarrassment. Sometimes, especially for working with people from different cultures, they are going to be very private. They are, again, going into a gender issue, not going to be comfortable with maybe a male caregiver working with them. Be patient again. You may need to bring in, if you're the male caregiver, bring in a female caregiver to kind of facilitate the work with you. Okay? Next, have a sense of humor and patience. I think those are one of the most important things. You have to be able to laugh at yourself and not take things so seriously. Again, Being a caregiver is very important, but at the same time, if you have a sense of humor, if you have patience, that will come across in dealing with the people you're caring for. Be aware of nonverbal messages and cues. Be aware sometimes if the person is telling you that they're doing okay, everything is fine, maybe some of those nonverbal messages they're giving you aren't matching up. Or maybe you are delivering some kind of different message based on your gestures, your body movements, those kinds of things. You need to be aware of those nonverbal messages. Next, listen for the hidden meanings in conversations. And this kind of goes back to what I was just saying. You may need to ask for clarification on some things because something may not be matching maybe when you're talking with the individual, what they're saying, how they're acting, or some of the other things that are going on in the context of the situation may not match. And there may be some underlying hidden messages here that you need to be aware of. So again, it's okay to ask for clarification of what's being said or what's happening. Avoid jargon. Oftentimes in healthcare we deal with technical terms. We sometimes use acronyms or abbreviations for things. It's easier for us. We're more familiar with that. Remember, people may not always understand what you're saying or what you mean by those things. You may need to go back and explain. You may need to draw a picture to help them understand a little bit more what you're saying. So again, avoid that jargon and those technical terms, especially dealing with patients and the elderly, I would think. Finally, put yourself in the other person's shoes. I think it's always valuable to say, what would I want to have done to me? How would I want to be treated if I were in that person's shoes? If you were the person lying in that bed, how would you want to be treated? What would you want to have done? What kinds of things would you want to have said? And again, how would you want them said to you? Bottom line, think in a way of customer service. You need to put yourself in that other person's shoes. So those are some of the strategies I think that will help you really develop some great cultural competency skills and to be able to effectively communicate across cultural lines. So in summary, I just need to say, one cannot become culturally competent after just one training session like we've had today. It takes hard work and must be integrated into your personal and your professional life. It's a process. It's a way of life. Thank you for your attention and good luck.